Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session number 4, Education Rights Issues Associated with COVID-19 Related Fall Grade Retention, Remedial Class Assignment, and Standardized Testing. I will be your moderator today. My name is Kaylin Belsha, and I'm a national education reporter for an education news site called Chalkbeat. And I am pleased to have with me today 4 amazing panelists. Today we have Elaine Allensworth, who is the director of the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, Jameson Brewer, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Culture, Language, and Leadership at the University of North Georgia, Amy Meek, who is a senior counsel at the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and Fred Jones, who is the director of Government Affairs and Public Policy for the Southern Education Foundation. So today we're going to be going over some really big, important topics that have to deal with what's happening to students during the coronavirus pandemic and how school districts are going to cope with helping them catch up in the fall. So some of the things that I've been seeing in my own reporting, as well as from my colleagues, is that there's a lot of concern right now about what schools are going to do to help students catch up on schools that they missed out in the spring, and what are the best ways to do that, given some of the inequities that we've seen. A lot of school districts who've reported data, as well as national surveys, have shown that some of the students who are most unlikely to log in or who have had a lot of trouble completing their work are students that we already knew were in disadvantaged groups. We've seen students from high poverty schools, as well as English language learners, students with special education plans, Black students, immigrant students, and homeless students being among the least likely to be able to complete their work. So we know that schools are going to have to do a big job to help them catch up. There's also a lot of question about whether or not schools should be following the retention policies that they already had in place, if they should consider new things for the fall, and what it could look like. What are the best practices for helping students catch up when we know that schools are going to have so much on their plates right now? They're going to be dealing with potentially smaller budgets. They're going to need to balance academics with social and emotional needs. And they're also going to have so many logistical uncertainties. Many school districts right now are in the process of figuring out if they should hold school virtually, in person, some combination, and they might also be planning for rolling closures if there are new outbreaks in their communities. On top of that, there are big questions about what school districts should do to assess student learning. Should we continue with the policies of the past? This year, Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, waived the mandate that schools have to administer federally required tests. So school districts, in many cases, won't have that data to rely on for the fall. Should they go forward with administering those tests? Should they do other kinds of diagnostics? What should we do for English learners, many of whom were not tested for proficiency this year? So these are really huge questions that we're going to be tackling, and I'm really glad to have my panelists here to walk us through some of these issues. First up, we have Elaine Allensworth, who will be presenting.
Excuse me. Oops. Trying to unmute, I'm sorry. Thank you, Kaylin. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I do research at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. My research has always been with the purpose of supporting educational policy and practice in the Chicago public schools and in schools across the country. This is an unprecedented time, and we're all scrambling to figure out what we know that can help practice. There have been many concerns that the disruptions in schooling that have accompanied the crisis have led to declining academic performance and will lead to a decrease in equity and educational outcomes beyond what we normally would see. And there's good reason for that. There's some real academic challenges with this crisis. A lot of learning has moved to online learning, remote learning. We know that online learning is less effective than in-person learning, especially for students who already were the furthest behind. It's also easier to do remote learning the more that families have economic resources. Although honestly, it's easier to do regular learning the more that families have economic resources, but it's become very obvious as schools have become increasingly reliant on technology, and there are such differences in access to technology. And then also Black and Latino families have faced additional stress with greater risks of exposure to the virus. and lower recovery rates. So we have these real equity concerns around this crisis. At the same time, there also are risks in pursuing educational strategies that only focus on academic remediation. If we take this very narrow focus and we aren't thinking about what it is that students are going to need to succeed in the fall, and we're just very focused on the skills, we do risk actually making things worse for students or causing more disruption in the school environment in the fall. As students and educators are going to continue to experience the trauma and economic impact of COVID-19, we need to put the impacts of loss of learning opportunities this spring or this fall into a broader context and consider strategies that are going to address all of these challenges. Strategies that just address learning loss, like remedial classes, doubling down on content, holding students back in grade, actually can end up causing more stress for students, and there's some real potential for adverse consequences. So if we think about strategies that support students' success more broadly, and strategies that help students regardless of why they might be struggling, because students could struggle in their courses this coming year for many, many different reasons related to all the changes in terms of the health concerns, economic changes, and remote learning and uncertainty in learning. So strategies that are really focused on supporting students and helping them be engaged regardless of the source of the challenge are going to be much more effective than those that are really narrowly focused on catching up on academic skills. And that's, first of all, because those strategies are more comprehensive. They're not just about learning loss, which is one piece of the puzzle, but it's also because students' engagement and success in their courses actually matters more for their long-term success than their content knowledge in any particular subject or their scores on standardized tests. It's about getting students engaged and making sure they have the supports that they need to succeed in school so that they can feel successful, so that they feel like they can be successful and they actually do succeed in school. Because ultimately, we want students to feel secure in this coming school year. The more logistically complicated our plans are for the fall, the more of a chance that students and educators will have a chaotic school year where the jobs of teaching and learning become secondary to meeting the demands introduced by all of these complicated new structures. There's so much uncertainty right now. So the more that we can have stability for students and that they can feel secure, that teachers can feel secure when they get back to school with predictable routines and supportive relationships, the more that they're likely to succeed. And we know from past research also that students can be resilient, but they need a stable, supportive environment to do that. And so if we have systems in place that provide support when students start to struggle and can provide whatever the support is they need, the academic support, the social emotional support, the economic support, so that they can fully engage in school, that's going to help everyone. It's going to help students and it's going to help teachers.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And so next up for presentation is Jameson Brewer.
Okay, thank you for having me here. If you could go to the next slide. I think that given the events of the past few weeks, this particular data is salient to highlight both the economic and racial disparities that we have across the country. These data points here, this is every single school district across the country disaggregated based on parents' socioeconomic status and the race of the students that are dominantly in those schools. This is pre-COVID data. I think that what the previous speaker said is important, that COVID, something that we've seen is the systemic inequalities that have existed in our schools for a long time have definitely been exacerbated by shifting everything online. But I think that historically, when we think about how do we approach fixing these educational opportunities, seems to me that for the past couple of decades, what we focused on in policy has been testing our way out of this and privatizing our way out of this. What that has led to is further segregation of our non-white students into the types of schools where they become isolated it becomes massively problematic for our approach to pre-COVID to think that we could test the solution for systemic racism and systemic poverty is helping students get better test scores. It just doesn't align with what the underlying problems are. And if you could advance to the next slide, please. So I have here sort of a dichotomy. I put here at the top a recommitment to, and I've put in parentheses because I'm not entirely sure that we've ever actually fully committed to some of these things. We have in name only, but I think that COVID has presented us the opportunity that we've never had in education before. There's been quite a bit of disaster capitalism through privatization that has followed some other disasters, whether it's Katrina in New Orleans or other types of manufactured crises that have existed in education for a long time. Here we have an actual opportunity to recommit to some equitable opportunities for all students. I think that we have to reject privatization in favor of a public obligation. I think that out of the silver lining of all of COVID is hopefully seeing communities, seeing people coming together and helping each other, whether wearing masks, because we understand that that's our social obligation to each other. I think we're at a point, instead of thinking about education as an individualistic commodity, I think we have the opportunity to carry over some of the COVID lessons about our public obligation to each other and bring it back into the schools. And I think that that has to include holistic education as opposed to high stakes testing. And as I say here, we have to continue to elevate the common good instead of thinking about the individualization, marketization, commodification, and standardization of these schools, because all that has done in the past few decades, based on what the data tells us, it has further exacerbated segregation, further exacerbated racial inequalities across our country. But we also can't think that we can fix all of these problems by fixing schools. 2/3 of student variance in schools is dictated based on out-of-school factors. So we have to have some type of systemic healthcare and food access reform. We can't have our students come to our classrooms who are hungry, who are fearful, who fear for their safety from whether it's police or any other types of violence in their communities, and expect them to do well. That just doesn't work. So we have to have some type of systemic reforms rather than sort of piecemeal incremental approaches. I think it's great that school districts across the country have continued the free and reduced lunch program throughout the online segment, but also extending it into summer. That's great. We have to go further. I think we have to think about measuring students in terms of academic growth rather than sort of arbitrary set points of proficiency. And I think that as a foundations professor, of course, I'm a bit biased, but thinking about that chart, thinking about the history of racial injustices in this country, generally speaking, but if you haven't been paying attention to the news in the past few weeks, you haven't been paying attention to how important it is for our pre-service teachers and our teachers of record to have a sense of culturally responsive pedagogy, to understand where their students are coming from, to understand that racial and economic injustice exist, and how they can, on a daily basis, work to ameliorate those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jameson. And next up, we have Amy Meek.
Good afternoon. I'm with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Our education equity work seeks to protect and promote access to education by addressing individual and systemic barriers that disproportionately impact historically disadvantaged communities using an explicit racial justice lens. As other panelists have noted, the COVID-19 crisis is compounding and exposing already crippling racial equity gaps in education. School closures are disproportionately affecting marginalized students. That includes students of color, low-income students, students with disabilities, English language learner students, students in immigrant families, migrant students, students in foster care, homeless students, LGBT students, and students in the juvenile justice system. And many of these are intersecting identities for students. Many students, particularly Black students, live in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus in a variety of ways. And I want to acknowledge the racial trauma that many Black students, families, and educators may be experiencing at this moment from anti-Black police violence and news coverage. We know that many marginalized students face multiple barriers to accessing remote learning. That may include devices or reliable internet access, but even beyond that, students may not have a quiet place to learn, especially for homeless students or students in the foster care system. Their caregivers may not have the time or capacity to support their learning, and students themselves may be essential workers or taking on additional caregiving responsibilities. And of course, students are experiencing a variety of stresses to their mental health and social emotional well-being, as well as physical well-being. Many schools have quickly adapted to try and address the challenge of providing meals, services, technology, and educational services to students in this difficult time. Unfortunately, we still see major equity gaps. To name a few, many students with disabilities are receiving inadequate services or none at all. Language access remains a major challenge. Schools have not been able to locate many homeless students, much less serve them. And of course, many students still do not have the technology needed for a basic level of participation in online learning. So what does this mean for students' rights? For one thing, schools should anticipate that many students will be able to seek compensatory education and services either now or in the future to address these gaps. Compensatory education is one remedy when schools fail to adequately serve students with disabilities, who make up about 14% or about 1 in 7 students. That's a significant proportion that's likely to be even higher now because students with needs stemming from complex trauma can seek accommodations under the disability laws. Schools have a legal duty to identify students with disabilities so that they can provide them services, and that should include identifying students who need trauma-related supports and services. It also means that schools should be taking a do no harm approach to assessments and to use them primarily to identify which students may need compensatory education and additional services, and not for failing or retaining students, awarding grades, or ranking school quality. Given the glaring inequities in the education that students are receiving in this moment, standardized tests are likely to disproportionately penalize and push out students of color, students with disabilities, and other marginalized students based on the barriers that they face rather than their own effort or skills. And decisions based on these grading or testing systems are likely to be systematically biased as a result, which may violate civil rights laws that prohibit this type of disparate impact. Addressing these gaps will require long-term planning and allocating funding for longer-term investments in schools. And I recognize that this is at a time when districts are inadequately funded in many areas, and many states are likely to slash budgets even further. I want to note in many states, a minimally adequate level of school funding is constitutionally protected and mandated. But because states can't run deficits, more federal funding is desperately needed. The Federal CARES Act funding can be used to address some of these needs in the short term, but the federal government must provide additional funding to avoid gutting state education budgets. And they must not require states to funnel money to private schools that are serving high proportions of high income students. In this process, states and districts should also examine the equity impact of their funding allocations. For example, I would be remiss in this moment not to mention that the cost of Chicago Public Schools' $33 million contract with the Chicago Police Department would more than cover their COVID-19 emergency expenditures to date on technology, educational materials, and student meal delivery. This is a difficult time in which no one has the right or complete answer to how to provide these services to students. But I want to note that accountability to equity in this time requires that families be part of the decision-making process for how schools respond to this crisis, and that the voices of marginalized students and families should be centered in this. Schools and districts should seek community input that prioritizes these voices. And this isn't for the benefit of families, it is to inform stronger policymaking. No matter how strong our intentions, equity gaps will continue to persist if we don't engage the lived experiences of our communities in finding solutions together.
Thank you, Amy. And Fred Jones will be presenting next.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Jones. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy for the Southern Education Foundation. I'm excited to be speaking with you all today. And also the Southern Education Foundation is one of the oldest standing education equity organizations in the country. It's about 152 years old and came about just after the Civil War to help the formerly enslaved population receive a quality education. But today, amid the coronavirus global pandemic, public schools and the 51 million students who attend them are experiencing a series of local epidemics. Many students are trying to secure meals, access stable digital learning platforms, and some students must contend with instances of child maltreatment. However, with intentional focus on equity, there's a pathway for us to reimagine how to deliver education in a way that better prioritizes students who need the most resources. The Coronavirus Relief, Economic and Security Act, also known as the CARES Act, allows states to submit waivers exempting them from administering state summative assessments during the spring of 2020. And in fact, all 50 states requested waivers and received approval from the US Department of Education not to test students for this 2019-2020 school year. However, just because states did not conduct final assessments, it does not mean students stopped learning. Segments of the population were able to seamlessly transition to remote learning without few or any complications. Other students, however, have not even been accounted for since March, when stay-at-home orders were first issued. It is clear that comprehensive diagnostic tests, which are formative assessments that highlight a student's understanding of academic content knowledge at a specific moment in time, should be performed on every student once school begins. And this should happen whether school districts can fully, partially, or virtually reopen in the fall. Districts should be rethinking how to elongate the school calendar year and school day to provide expanded learning time for students who are the furthest behind. Implementing ELT would allow districts to take advantage of summers, holiday breaks, and even some weekends to help address learning loss spurred by the coronavirus. However, students should not be punished if their school district and/or home life was ill-prepared or unconducive for distance learning during a 100-year global pandemic. Research shows that adverse outcomes associated with students who are held back, especially when there can be a plan to catch them up while they're early in their educational career. Black and low-income students will disproportionately suffer if it becomes a widely accepted policy to universally hold students back due to the coronavirus impact on student achievement. And lastly, grading policy should encompass flexibility, growth, content mastery. While students and teachers adjust to blended and distance learning protocols, schools should adopt pass-fail grading models and also be open to creating virtual office hours. And then also, just in conclusion, because of COVID-19 has impacted every single student in this country, it is time that we use this opportunity to rethink how education is delivered and create individualized education plans for every student in this country. Those plans should include both academic and non-academic resources that allow students to succeed and graduate college and career ready. And thank you.
Thank you so much to Fred and to all four of the panelists for presenting. We're going to move into some question and answers now, which I'm really excited for. So there's been some new reporting that's coming out about exactly how much learning loss students have experienced. Some indicate several months, some indicate up to a full school year. And in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd, we know that a lot of schools experienced additional disruption this week. A lot of teachers pivoted to working on that curriculum instead. And a lot of schools just ended early for the year. So my question to all of you is, how concerned should we be about the learning loss that students have experienced? And what exactly do you think schools would need to help them catch up? Is this something that they can do on their own, or is there assistance that they're going to need? Elaine?
Yeah. So I would say be aware, but don't overreact. there have been these estimates that students will lose half a year of learning. There are a lot of assumptions behind those estimates, first of all. But even if it's true, for the vast majority of students, if they were a half year behind where they normally would be, they would still be on grade level at the next year. So it's, they may struggle a little bit more than they normally would, but there's such a large range in terms of skill levels at any given grade level that a half year of learning is still well within the normal range for students. And so to put them back in any way would actually set them back. And most teachers, they spend time reviewing content from the prior year. You don't just teach students one thing and they remember it forever. Our brains don't work that way. We have to keep engaging with content over and over again, or we forget it, right? And so part of the normal teaching process is to be doing review. Now, that's not to say that some students are going to, there are going to be some students who really struggle, both from missing instruction in the spring, and also from all the disruption that's probably still going to be happening, and from the economic downturn that's going to be happening, and that's going to cause students to have increased challenges in terms of engagement. And so it's going to be really critical to be monitoring how students are doing really closely and reaching out right away to figure out why students might be struggling, and then get them the support they need, whether that's additional academic support or support in terms of being able to do work while at home, or to balance other demands that they have.
Amy?
Yeah, I think to build on what Elaine said, I'm less concerned, I think, about learning loss in terms of content, and more concerned about schools addressing trauma, mental health needs, and those really expanded needs that we're going to see, particularly moving into the fall, and the more tenuous connection to school for students who have, found barriers to participating in online learning. One thing that we know, for example, from research on exclusionary discipline is that the longer that a student is disconnected from school, the less likely they are to eventually graduate. And while this is a slightly different context, I think that those similar lessons really are likely to apply here.
Fred?
Well, I'm extremely concerned. I do agree with the other panelists where I think there is a wide estimate in terms of how much students the learning loss has taken place since March, and also obviously the trauma may be even a bigger factor, as Amy just mentioned. But I think we should keep in mind how pervasive this problem is in certain areas. And I think especially considering the South and Southern states specifically, where the majority of the South has low-income kids and kids of color who, really low-income kids in particular, just haven't either been accessing any type of remote or distance learning since March. But additionally, even before the coronavirus epidemic, there were many students who were very far behind already. And so I think the learning loss on top of coronavirus and the mental health issues that are going on, the instability of our school system, the instability of our health system. There's a lot of teachers actually in the state of Georgia who have COVID-19 who may not just come back to the school system itself. So there's an infrastructure problem in place. And I'm very pessimistic about our school system and how we're going to react to this situation. I definitely think that there are some school districts who will be able to handle this quite well, and communities who will be able to respond quite well. But I do think there is a pervasive amount of folks across this country and students across this country where I don't know what the answer is going to be at this point in time. And there has to be some type of dramatic change in the way that we deliver instruction and support students with wraparound services, as well as families during this time. And it's something that we're going to have to commit to over a period of 2 or 3 or even 4 years extensively.
Did any of the other panelists want to add anything? Jameson?
Yeah, I think just to echo the things that have been said, I definitely agree that if we rush back to, if the first question that we're asking as soon as our students are back in the classroom, or what does their achievement look like? What have they lost in terms of learning? What might their test scores be? I think we're asking the wrong questions. I think those perhaps could be reasonable questions at some point in the future. But again, I think this has already been very well stated. Something that we have to focus first on is the emotional well-being of our students, both from K through 12. But as was also said, we also have to think about the emotional and medical well-being of our teachers, because this is, we can't simply focus on testing. And I hope it came across in my remarks earlier. I think that that's where we have struggled in the past. I think that schools that have done very well at getting achievement scores higher, getting test scores higher, I think that's well and fine. But I think that schools that have become the very best at that have actually become the very best at what is likely the very worst part of education policy in the past 20 years. So I think the question has to be, how do we have those wraparound services that Fred talked about? How do we make sure that students are coping with the trauma of both COVID as well as what we're seeing in terms of racial injustice across the country?
Go ahead, Elaine.
I just wanted, in case I came off sounding optimistic, I didn't mean to sound optimistic in terms of saying don't panic. I actually think we need to be like really thoughtful and concerned. What I'm concerned about, what I don't want us to do is to be so focused on the academic, and I don't want us to forget the academics. Like, we've got to make sure students are not falling behind and we're giving them all the academic support that they need, but that we're not narrowly focused on the learning loss and the academics and not thinking about all the supports that they need, or putting new practices in place, or new policies, which I think we're going to talk about, that are so focused on the academics and students being behind that they actually could have negative consequences for students.
And I just want to circle back to the end of the question, which was, do we think schools can actually do this work if they don't get additional assistance? We're right now watching Congress debate whether or not schools should get some kind of additional relief package. Mitch McConnell has indicated he thinks schools do need more money, but I think it's really unclear how much more they're going to get. And from what we've seen plan-wise, a lot of folks are spending money on things that are like setting up logistics inside classrooms. We know people are going to need hand washing stations and additional just like materials inside the class. And so how many of them are actually going to have money to do the kinds of wraparound services that you all are suggesting? So I'm just kind of curious what assistance you think schools are going to need and how possible is this really? Jameson.
I think that when it comes to answering this question, thinking about teachers, I think that the answer is that teachers will, because that's what teachers have always done. They've always done what they have to do for their students, regardless of the resources that they have available. That said, I think it's clear that pre-COVID, we had a resource problem, both inside and outside of schools, that was already existent. COVID has simply exacerbated, and I can appreciate that. Downturns in the economy are going to change tax income, and that's going to shift. But I also think that if we look broadly to the federal budget, as was mentioned earlier, I think that we can see that some of the federal funding entities still are being prioritized, and education has for far too long been deprioritized. This is the time for us to make a rallying cry for the proper funding that we need, and it has to come from the federal government, because as I think Amy suggested, states can't operate on deficits, but the federal government can. But I think back to the beginning, even without some sort of optimistic hope for additional funding, teachers will do what is best for students, because that's what they have always done.
Did anyone else want to add anything before we move on? Okay. So I would like to move on to the question of summer school. We have seen a lot of different approaches that districts plan to take. Some that are in states that are already reopening have talked about trying to hold small group sessions in person. A lot of them are going to be doing their summer school online. And there's been a lot of equity questions raised about that because some students who were not able to access their classwork during the school year are now going to be asked to do that virtually. There's not really an indication that anyone's able to just quickly ramp up their technology distribution over the summer to change that. In some places, summer school is optional, but in many places it will be required for students who got incompletes or low grades during the school year. So I'm curious for all of you, how do you think we should be using summer school this year as a nation? And what are the ways that we can balance that lack of technology access with the desire that many schools have to stay in contact with their students and to try their best to try and catch them up in whatever way that they can? Amy.
Just some initial thoughts. I do think that that summer school can, for example, be part of a compensatory education plan for students with disabilities. So, that's one important role that it can play. As I think you mentioned, one way that schools could be using summer schools, again, kind of continuing with addressing specific needs of students with disabilities or who may have other types of, more intensive needs. It might be used as a way to bring back kind of smaller groups of students who really need the in-person supports or in-person services that really cannot be provided remotely. And while schools really have stepped up and identified a lot of really innovative ways to provide things like therapy remotely, there are some supports that really need to be provided in person. So that's another role for summer school, and particularly for sort of small groups of in-person instruction. I've also seen some schools using it as a way of establishing additional supports for remote learning. So trying to use summer school as another way to start distributing more devices, more internet hotspots, and so on. So I think those are all really important roles for summer school and ways that summer school can be used basically to provide the additional supports, the additional services, and the additional education that I think folks on this panel have been talking about. I am deeply concerned about schools using it as a reason to hold back or retain students for exactly the reason that you mentioned, which is that it really piles on the inequity on top of inequity to say to a student, you experienced barriers during the school year that prevented you from logging on or engaging in remote learning. And so the answer is to require you to, again, for 3 or 2 or, however many months, require you to, again, try and surmount all of these barriers. Again, to use that as a reason to hold back students or to assess students, I think is really just going to pile the inequities on.
Did anyone else want to add anything about looking at how we should use summer school? Fred?
Yeah, I really agree with what Amy just said. The only thing that I would like to add is if schools are going to use summer schools or summer school, that they think about this over a 2 or 3 year time frame and using summer school, hopefully this summer if they can, if it's safe to do so. If it's not safe to do so, how can they do it successfully remotely? But again, students should not be punished if they weren't able to access curriculum and access information during this pandemic. Schools, I would hope that they would think about using summer school as a tool to catch students up and use that over time. So think about the summer, then the academic year, next summer, the academic year, and the following summer. And think about this over a much longer period of time in terms of catching kids up and using it as a tool to rethink how we deliver instruction altogether.
Did anyone else want to add anything? Okay. So moving on to the hot question about assessment. As some of my panelists mentioned earlier, the Education Secretary gave states the option to waive their federally mandated tests this year, and all of them did. So a big question is, what should we do about assessments in the coming school year? Is it that we try to administer those tests that students missed? Do we just go for diagnostic tests? Like, what are we thinking about how students should be assessed, and what would you like to see? Elaine.
Yeah. So getting a good read on where students are this fall is going to be really hard. We have no idea what circumstance we're going to be in, the conditions that students would be tested in. Testing in general, it takes instructional time, and sometimes you don't, it's hard to even, a lot of times schools aren't even set up to use the data very well. And so I think to the extent that that schools have short assessments that they can use to gauge where students are so that they know who needs extra help, or so that they can figure out where they need to pitch instruction at the beginning of the year, that could be helpful. If they have assessments that they're used to using at the start of the year and they know what that means in terms of instruction and extra help, that could be helpful. I wouldn't introduce a whole new testing system, a whole new test which the teachers have to figure out. It would just introduce chaos, more confusion, more cognitive load for teachers. I wouldn't say that I don't think it's possible for us. I think there are a lot of policy analysts that would like to test students this fall to get an idea of how much learning loss there actually was over the spring. I don't think we can get good estimates of that, even if we did test students, and it would take a lot of, it would take time from students and teachers for data that I don't think actually would be very useful in instruction.
Jameson?
I think this is the perfect opportunity for us to completely abandon high stakes testing. Think that we could approach this with diagnostic teacher-led, district-led testing. I simply don't see the benefit of particularly rushing back to doing the standardized testing that Elaine just mentioned. But also, as she said, so much of instructional time has been wasted for a long time simply as teachers have to prepare for these tests and actually administer these tests. We don't need dozens and dozens and dozens of thermometers probing into something to know what's happening. Assessment is important, yes, but I think that this is the moment that we are at, that we will likely never be at again, where we can see the full abolition of high stakes testing.
Fred, I want to get to you in a minute, but Jameson, I just want to push back on that a little bit. There are requirements in federal law that states administer the tests, and the reason we didn't have to do them this year is because of the waivers. So are you advocating for states pushing for additional waivers? I guess, how do you see that actually happening?
I think it could be states getting waivers. I also think that to the extent that that doesn't happen, I think that teachers have the autonomy within their own profession to push back themselves. We saw it in Seattle with the MAP testing a handful of years ago, where teachers just simply refused to give the test. And the reason that they did so was because they're the ones who understand their students' needs. With my pre-service teachers, I often ask them, what is the best measurement that we have for gauging how students are doing? What would it be called? And students are conditioned. Most of these students have come through No Child Left Behind, and just an era of testing and accountability. And we very quickly forget that teachers are the best diagnostic tool that we have for where their students are, not external high stakes testing.
Fred, did you want to add something?
Yes, I did. I really think that whenever the school year can begin, the diagnostic tests be administered, formative tests, and have that information be used to help improve instruction. I think that's the appropriate use of assessments for when schools start back up. However, I do think that there is extreme value in still having summative assessments, maybe at the end of I guess at that point, 2021. This is assuming that we can have some type of normalcy to the academic year. But if you make that assumption, I still think that there's extreme value of having those federal summative assessments that are used still for accountability purposes. But hopefully with the, that's after hopefully a year of instruction. I also think that these high stakes tests aren't the only tests, or even the formative assessments aren't the only tests that students should be taking. I think there are opportunities to at least have social and emotional learning surveys, parent surveys, and other forms of information that are administered in the fall to gain more information to see how students are doing, to help direct the wraparound services that my other panelists have already talked about as well. So we should also make sure that we don't exclude that information in this conversation as well, because I think that's an important role and additional information we should be gaining from our students and families.
I can just add a couple additional points. One is that I think this is an area where schools and districts and states should be really soliciting and listening to student voices and student input on these issues. I know that there are a couple of groups, for example, Chicago Public Schools high school students who've been really active in calling for changes to the grading policy and really providing their voices to the student experience of how they feel about being graded and tested during this time, and the stress and the impact that has on them. The other note that I just want to make is about the role of assessments in school ratings policies and the impact that can have down the road in terms of disinvesting in certain schools, and that particularly, again, where the assessments are likely to reflect structural inequities is something that we should really be pushing back on.
Elaine, did you want to add something? Oh, it looked like you did. Okay. Okay. So this is related to that last question, but it has to do more with progress monitoring and what you think schools might be able to do in that regard. Obviously, as everyone's mentioned, students are going to be coming in at different levels at the beginning of the school year, as they do every year, but in addition, even more this year. So I guess, does anyone have any ideas for what schools could do to be watching how students are progressing? And are there ways that we can specifically have interventions that are targeted for students who are at different levels throughout the school year, but are in the same grade? Elaine.
Yeah, I think actually really monitoring how students are doing is going to be super critical. And it's probably the most important thing that we can do. We're never going to find any kind of assessment or survey that's going to be able to capture all the different challenges that students might be facing, or the reasons why they might be disengaging in school or struggling in any way. And so the best data that you can, we also like things like, login, if we have remote learning, things like login data, all that stuff, that's not very accurate data. That doesn't tell us very much. The best data is finding out, like, are students actually engaging in school? Are they turning in assignments? Are they getting things done? Are they taking their tests? Are they doing well on their tests? Those kinds of things that day to day, and then finding out, like, if they're missing assignments, if they're not getting their work done, talking to students, talking to families, figuring out what the challenge is. It could be, the learning loss. It could be stress. It could be a problem. There's so many reasons students might be struggling. And if you don't do anything, if you just kind of allow it to happen, say, oh, they just can't engage, they must be having challenges, or they don't care. A lot of times there's mentality and, well, they don't really care, or they're too busy with other things. Then they're just going to keep falling further and further behind. And a lot of times, what students most need is to figure out, how do I deal with this challenge, right? And if you can intervene early, you can help them, deal with whatever that is. You can figure out, do they need a tutor? Do they need a mentor? Do they need support in terms of a place to study? Whatever, do they need mental health services? Whatever it is, that's going to help them engage right away. So that they don't fall behind. Because once students start falling behind, it's so hard to catch up. It's so much easier to keep students from failing than it is to have them catch up after they've fallen far behind. And so the more that we're really closely monitoring student engagement and making sure that they have whatever supports they need, that's how we're going to be successful. And that's true normally in school. Chicago Public Schools have seen huge improvements in in high school graduation and freshman achievement learning gains, when they started paying attention to student engagement data and coming together as teacher teams to try to figure out, strategies for helping students. We need more of that. It's hard because you need time, you need resources, but that's how you actually end up supporting students regardless of the source of their struggles.
Did anyone else want to add anything about some best practices for progress monitoring for the coming school year? Then Elaine, I think I have a follow-up question for you. You mentioned this, that we've seen some pretty not great data from districts about login data versus engagement data, and it's been very difficult for people to figure out what's actually happening.
Yeah.
So I guess, would you recommend that school districts be looking at better engagement tracking? Or I guess, like, how do we wrap our hands around what's actually happening? I've seen pushback of some schools want to track it themselves, some districts want to track it, and they have like this crazy system for looking at it. So I guess I'm curious, as a researcher, what would you recommend school districts be thinking about for trying to look at this engagement?
Yeah, I know some schools are doing an amazing job with tracking engagement, and they'll have they'll have logs, for every student, every adult, who's been in contact with the student, with the family, notes about, if there are particular challenges or, how they're doing. And then, other schools don't even have contact information for families and students and have been really struggling to reach out to them. I do think that it is really important to, especially in the time of remote learning, but especially in the time of remote learning, or if we have unstable, whatever learning that is sometimes, who knows what's going to happen in the fall, that we are keeping track of the engagement of teachers with students and teachers with families. If you do that systematically, you can see who is not being engaged, right? It allows just, it kind of puts, by having systems in place, it makes it easier for everyone, and it keeps students from falling through the cracks. And it doesn't have to be some schools have very complicated systems that work for them. It doesn't have to be a very complicated system. We probably want some uniformity across schools in the district so that the district can see what's happening across different schools in some kind of uniform way. But when you do that, it's, there have been schools in the past that have I know one school in particular had a policy that if students were absent from school, that every teacher they had that day would have to call home to find out what was happening with the student and make sure the student didn't fall behind. That school had the best attendance in the district. It was a high school. It had better attendance than the most selective enrollment school, and it served students who came into high school with below average achievement, and its graduation rates were well beyond those of other similar schools. So, paying attention to that engagement is like really kind of, it seems basic, but it's something that doesn't always happen and is can be really transformative.
I'd like to move on now to one of the other topics that our panel is touching on, that's looking at retention. And some of you mentioned this in your presentation. So I'm curious what all of you are thinking about when it comes to grade retention and what you'd like to see districts considering. Obviously, some states have policies in place, Mississippi and others, Florida, that require certain kinds of retention. But when we're looking at what just happened, I'm just curious. I'm going to open it up for what everyone would like to see as far as retention policies go. Elaine.
Yeah, sometimes grade retention can be for some reason, it's a very popular strategy because people have this idea that students should be on grade level. But as I was saying before, there is no such thing as on grade level. Students have a wide variety of skills at any grade level, and students also develop in different ways at different times. And so, when you hold students back on the basis of whatever, a test score, whatever, they're not necessarily going to be on grade level, even if they're held back, and they're going to be developmentally different from other students. And it may not seem like a big deal in the early grades if students are held back, but once students enter the middle grades in high school, they become developmentally, they're in a developmentally very different place from other students. And it puts them at high risk for disengaging from school. And especially, you know, if they end up, a student then ends up starting high school at age 15 or age 16, that means they have to stay in school until they're 19 or 20 if they're going to graduate, right? And so they just become, you don't necessarily see the negative impacts at first, but later on, there are negative impacts. And so you're really putting students at risk when you hold them back in school. And it's also expensive.
Fred?
Yeah, well, I wanted to highlight actually a couple things that Elaine just said, especially even the last point. But before I did that, there are a few, at least localities and states that have made modifications to their retention policy in light of this moment. So, or have vocalized bluntly that they won't be holding any of their students back. So in Baltimore, the chief of schools there has said that she's going to promote all of her students there. In Mississippi and Virginia, and also in Arizona, have all waived their retention policies. And so I wanted to make sure that I express those things because states are starting to take and modify certain laws to ensure that students are able to move on to the next grade, despite what has happened today. And then additionally, I think there is a way, especially early on in a student's life, where you can continue to promote that student. And if they're still behind grade level, to create a plan to catch them up to speed. One, I mean, it is certainly possible. And in our school districts are doing it every day. And then two, it's much cheaper than holding a student's back. So that's what the point that Elaine was just getting at the end. And I wanted to make sure that we elevate that on this conversation, because it is way more expensive to have some universal broad policy to hold a majority or even a significant portion of students behind because of this moment. And it's going to cost the state, the district, and taxpayers more money. And it's not necessarily going to be something that's more effective in the long run.
Could you just elaborate a little bit on what are some of the added costs for retention?
I mean, you just have to do everything all over again. You're doubling the classrooms, doubling the support, you're limiting who's graduating. The fixed costs just of a school are exacerbated. And so that is the additional worry. And then whatever, I think the national average in terms of per pupil spending is around, it's just over $12,000. Just imagine that being doubled when in fact, you can probably provide all of the supports a child may need for less than $12,000. And so that's why I think it's a cheaper option just to promote the students and provide them with the extra supports that they need rather than to hold a student back.
Did any of the other panelists want to add anything on that?
I think Fred is right on. And the other point that I wanted to reiterate that Fred made earlier is about thinking about this in a sort of 2, 3, 4 year plan, you know, that you can be thinking about, okay, how are we going to be supporting this student with, you know, maybe summer school or additional tutoring, you know, 2 or 3 years down the line, particularly at whatever point we're starting to resume more regular in-person instruction. And that, you know, it's not about sort of what's going to happen at the end of this year. And if they haven't made it up by the end of this summer, then we just have to start them over again.
When it comes to instructional strategies that you're hoping school districts might consider for the coming school year, is there anything that rises to the top? I know as a journalist, we've looked at some folks are floating the idea of looping, which might mean that your teacher from last year might have some contact with you for the following year. Are there other things that you're seeing being discussed or that you'd like to see school districts consider, either interventions or other supports that you'd like to see them provide? Who wants to jump start on that? Fred.
Sorry, I was trying to get my my notes up here so I can be specific. One thing that I talked about in my opening statement was expanded learning time. And there are other countries, especially the countries that outpace the United States, that have much longer school years. And so that ranges from like 190 days, some of it's 200 days. Most schools in the United States are around 180 days. And so you have Hong Kong, you have, there are four of the top five countries on the PISA results have expanded learning time. So sure, there is some type of a peak element. You can't just add days and days and days and hours and hours and hours, but certainly even an extra hour a day, or even an extra 5 to 10 days after the school year, we see has had results for students who are behind at grade level. So I would think that that was something that schools would consider, is using effective expanded learning time.
Yeah, there also are effective strategies around intensive tutoring and mentoring, and those are not add-on programs that are disconnected from school, but programs that are embedded in school, where the tutors or the mentors are either people in the school or people working with the teachers with the goal of supporting students so they can engage in school, so that they're successful in their classes. We see improvements in attendance, grades, and learning gains when students have that support that's, again, really tied to helping them succeed in their classwork. But I'll say, you mentioned the looping, relationships are really important. A lot of times people forget, or they don't realize that learning really is social, it's emotional. Relationships are really important. And we've seen in past research, for example, that summer school teachers are more effective if they were the same teacher students had the prior school year, right? Because they already know the students, and they can build those strong relationships with students and with families the longer that they know them.
One other note that I want to make is that schools should be rethinking, this is sort of a moment for schools to be rethinking punitive attitudes around school attendance and around discipline. That I think this is a moment where, maybe more than ever before, folks are realizing that there are so many barriers to students being able to attend school, whether that's remotely or in person. And, and I really am hoping that that lesson translates into schools and school districts continuing to take sort of a positive approach to engaging students, as opposed to, there are schools and districts that take a really punitive approach, including, seeking to fine or prosecute parents for truancy and lack of school attendance. And similarly, that this is a moment to be thinking about rethinking exclusionary discipline, which is something that, Illinois and Chicago Public Schools have made huge strides in, that I want to recognize, but that particularly when we're returning to in-person instruction, that it doesn't go back to sort of business as usual, and that schools really use this opportunity to continue to rethink ways of engaging students and creating a positive as opposed to punitive culture.
Any other thoughts on that question? Well, I think I have a follow-up question for you, Amy. You mentioned this earlier around compensatory services and what that should look like in the fall. One thing I've heard people say and caution is that you can't just cram compensatory services into a short period of time. So I'm curious, what you're going to be watching for when it comes to compensatory services, and what you would like to see districts doing when it comes to that.
Wow. I mean, I think, there's a lot to unpack there. It does need to be individualized, and so I think there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to that issue. And I think it also is really likely to depend on whether, and to what extent we see in-person instruction in the fall. I do think it's important for schools to be thinking about compensatory education and compensatory services really broadly and really proactively, and to be thinking again about this as it shouldn't be let's cram this all in the fall to make up for the last 6 months. It really needs to be part of a 2, 3, 4 year plan, and there needs to be a a conversation about how we make that longer term investment in schools to do that.
And we're coming up toward the end of the panel. We have 10 minutes left. So I think for one of my final questions, I was hoping to ask each of you what you will be paying very close attention to when it comes to the fall, and just some of the things that you personally are going to be watching for and that you think will be important to keep track of. Maybe could we start with Jameson on that?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, because I think the appropriate answer is all of the things. Yeah, just to return to something else that we had said previously, I think that if our rush back into the schools is how quickly can we address any type of testing or achievement gaps, and how can we close those as fast as possible. I think that what I'm looking forward to is an increase in funding. I know that the teachers will do what they've always done, what's always best for their students. But again, I think that so many of the problems that we're seeing or that we're projecting post-COVID, they were already there. We have systemic racism in this country. We have systemic income inequality in this country. Schools exacerbate those things. So I think that what I will be looking for is hopefully a shift in thinking that we can fix those things by fixing test scores, that we can fix those things if we can just get better teachers. I think that some of those conversations are important and worthwhile, but they cannot be done in a vacuum. We can't help students if we're just thinking about how to improve schools.
Who wants to take that one next? Elaine?
Oh, go ahead, Fred.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question, but a very good question. The one thing that I do want us to, or I specifically will be paying attention to, and it kind of is a follow-up to what Jameson just said, is around funding, both at the state and federal level. So in the CARES Act, the money that was funneled to K-12 schools originally estimated came out to about $270 per student across the country, which is not a lot of money in investments. And then we're having debates now with the US Secretary of Education around school districts sharing the already limited resources with private schools. And so, because of equitable services. And so there's been analysis out there. So like in the state of Louisiana, if the guidance goes through the way the secretary intended it, it's over 275% of increased money for private schools will go because of this new guidance. And we see districts across this country, anywhere from 0 to about 30 or 40% of what's been allocated to them through the CARES Act will now be going to private schools that have different levels of wealth within those private schools. And the SEF is fundamentally opposed to that sort of action. I think additionally, there's been estimates in state budgets how the coronavirus pandemic is going to affect overall revenue. And so we can't think about getting through this moment in time from a federal or state perspective by just cutting our way out of it. We have to be looking at revenue increases. It's just not possible for our states to function the way that it needs to, and with the constitutional obligation that states have to provide a free and varying quality education throughout the states, unfortunately, with some of these constitutions. But there is a constitutional mandate. And so if we're not looking at ways in which to raise revenues, unfortunately, states are not going to meet their constitutional mandate. So in addition to raising revenues at the state and federal level, there has to be just an elevated focus on funding. And I do think funding does matter. And so, but it has to be at a level where it can't just be $270 per student. It has to be something that's significant and can make a difference, that will allow substantive gains, both from an academic and a non-academic standpoint. So where we're having school counselors, where we're having additional reading instruction folks, the mental health component. I mean, there's a subset of resources that we're going to need at this point in time. And it's just going to take money. And especially in low-income schools, a lot of them are communities of color, but we have to look at this from a wealth standpoint and a structural standpoint to invest in the schools that need it the most. And that has to include some significant funding increases and revenue increases, but at the federal and state level.
Fred, I want to just ask you a follow-up on that. Are you concerned about what we've been seeing already coming out of states? We've seen some say that they're going to cut their education budgets. Some have said that they will preserve it, but we're already seeing some indication that states are intending to make cuts. And so I'm curious what you're watching and how concerned are you about that?
I mean, SEF, we have a broad definition of the South, but we include 17 states. We go as north as Delaware, and as west as Oklahoma, including Missouri and all of this. And we're paying close attention to what the state discussions around the education budget is. And Georgia, where SEF is headquartered, I mean, they're making cuts to education. And they've asked across the board cuts in every agency by about 14 or 15%. Education takes up the largest portion of the state budget in Georgia. And so we're incredibly concerned that these budget cuts will adversely affect education, just given how big of a budget that they have within specific states and also the federal government as well. So I think the feds certainly have to step up. I think in the HEROES Act, there was additional money for K through 12, but still not at the level that we need. There has been efforts by members of Congress, I think, to increase that level to about $305 billion for K through 12. Which is actually what we need to make a substantive difference in our states. So we are really concerned with what's going on. I do want to highlight at least one positive example where the governor in Tennessee has at least said that he's going to maintain level funding for education that comes at the expense of I think, the ESA program, the literacy investments and other things. But at least we've seen some states say that they are at least commit to existing funding levels for education, but there's tremendous concern, tremendous. One last thing, the expected budget shortfall in Arkansas, for example, in K through 12 education is about 80% of what the governor requested originally in the budget before the coronavirus. So we just see that states are just going to be in a tough position if they're not going to think about significant revenue increases and assistance from the feds.
And we have about 2 minutes left. Elaine and Amy, do you have any last thoughts on this topic?
Sure. I would say I know there's a lot of work that's going in right now to try to plan for all the logistics of the fall with a lot of uncertainty. It's just consuming districts, and my primary concern, I think, for this coming fall is that we don't end up having such a chaotic, kind of confusing start to the school year. That we're really impeding the opportunity to have strong teaching and learning. And I would get caution against people trying to do things that are very disruptive, in an effort to do things in a new way, but that you don't have time to plan out really thoroughly. And also, I'm also a little concerned people will just say, oh, let's just do what we can and kind of give up. And then again, you have inequities in terms of who can access education. And so I'm going to be looking for, what school districts are doing to have a stable start to the school year.
The one additional thing that I want to add to what's already been said is that we'll be looking for schools and districts and states to really be seeking community input, to be centering the voices of the students and the families who are most affected in this time, and to make sure that even though everyone's sort of trying to move very quickly and plan for a lot of eventualities, that there is that voice and that community input in the process.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this panel today. And thank you to my panelists, Elaine, Jameson, Amy, and Fred. I really appreciate your time today and your great answers to the questions.